Okay. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for coming.
Glad to be here, John.
We've got an audience for you, Americans who are interested in the International Criminal Court, some positively, some not so positively. They've seen a text already which describes your distinguished career, so we don't need to do an introduction.
Okay.
I understand you've been hearing some introductions today anyway, so we can go right to our discussion.
Okay, glad to.
You're here for the meeting of the Assembly of State Parties, which is the court's governing body, and it happens to end on Human Rights Day, which is December 10th. And I wanted to start by asking you to talk a little bit with members of the audience who don't quite get the relationship between human rights and what the court does. Everybody knows about the traditional work on human rights internationally and nationally that is celebrated on Human Rights Day. A lot of people, you and I think, have a pretty clear idea of how human rights relates to what the court does. I think there are a lot of people out there who would like to hear from you about that.
Okay. Well, understand that the criminal courts are dealing with the most serious violations of human rights, sometimes called, the area of international humanitarian law. And this generally involves acts of violence, of murder and rape and mutilation, but crimes that are most often, targeted against civilians, sometimes motivated by race and religion and other kinds of identity, sort of issues. That's usually a situation where a leader is sort of exploiting some kind of division in order to maintain power by demonizing a group, etc. But and the crimes that the court is involved in. Most famously, of course, is genocide, intentional destruction of an ethnic, religious, or other group, in whole or a significant part, with crimes like mass murder, and it can include acts of rape or other ways, forcible imitations of births. There are ways in which it can be done that doesn't involve murder. Then there are crimes against humanity, and outside the Rome Statute, crimes against humanity haven't generally appeared in statutory language. The law of crimes against humanity comes to us from international custom and was most famously prosecuted at Nuremberg. But the crimes against humanity are crimes of violence committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack on a civilian population. And then war crimes, which of course can include in most situations in which civilians are intentionally targeted during an armed conflict, although they can also include other situations where people who are outside of combat, individuals that are prisoners of war or shipwrecked, even enemies, but who are no longer engaged in the combat meeting, treated appropriately and not tortured and killed. But that's, it's an area of human rights where the most horrendous things occur, and the court and the other institutions that have been established are there in order to achieve accountability, and we hope deter these crimes by sending a signal: if you do these kind of crimes, you'll face consequences.
So that's what the court does for people who are victims. We know that the traditional human rights does something for victims because it shames or condemns or can, under certain circumstances, impose sanctions that may get a government to change its behavior. What does the court do for victims? What comes out of the court's process that does something for those who have suffered from these human rights violations that are part of the atrocities you've described?
Okay. Well, we have to understand, and the ICC, of course, has specific provisions for victims. But before I go there, because the ICC is just the latest manifestation of the International Justice Project that began at Nuremberg. It was sort of in stasis for 45 years, and then we had the Yugoslavia Tribunal and the Rwanda Tribunal and Sierra Leone Court and other courts that have been established. And until the ICC came along, there was not a specific provision for, say, reparations or representation of victims. But I don't want to minimize the importance to victims of justice being achieved. and a clear statement that says that these people, these perpetrators, were responsible for what was done to you, and that what happened to you was not your fault. You didn't bring it on yourself. It was this intentional, horrendous crime. And so often people who are victims end up stigmatized.
Yes.
I had amputees in Sierra Leone that said that, during one part of the peace process when it was decided to amnesty the rebels, they came back in the town and humiliated them and said, you were half men. We chopped off your hands, but continue to humiliate them. It happens with rape victims as well. And a clear statement internationally, these are the guys that are responsible. You were the victims. You have the right to justice in this case is important. And I remember when I prosecuted the media trial in Arusha.
That was the Rwanda Tribunal.
The Rwanda Tribunal
Yeah.
that prosecuted those responsible for the Rwanda genocide, the murder of 800,000 human beings in 100 days in 1994. I prosecuted the leaders of the media, this famous RTLM radio, some people called hate radio,
right.
or a newspaper denounced and called for the killing of the Inyenzi, the cockroaches, etc. We had very prominent accused, including one of the most famous men in Rwanda, who was the head of the radio, effective head of the radio, a PhD from the University of Paris, who was one of the most successful men in the country. We convicted him, and he was sentenced to life by the trial chamber. And I remember talking to a victim afterwards who watched in the audience whose whole family was killed during the genocide. They'd been cockroaches, they'd been Yenzi, Tutsis, and they'd been targeted by this radio. He said he never thought he would see the day when men who were so powerful that he couldn't even approach them would be held to account and maybe condemned for what they did. And he said, this is the greatest day of my life. And so, obviously, we haven't provided any reparation in a financial sense, but it was an extremely meaningful thing for victims. So I don't think we should ever minimize that part of it. On the other hand, it's a challenge in